So good afternoon. I'm Brett Perlman, President and CEO of the Center for Houston's Future, and welcome to our fourth webcast in our Energy and Climate Thought Leadership series, in which we've been discussing a variety of topics. We've been honored to have Harvard's Rebecca Henderson, Peter Fox-Pinner from Boston University, and Tufts University's Amy Myers-Jaffe in the past. And we're very pleased to have Katharine Hayhoe join us, and I'll introduce her in a second. Before we get into today's program, I'd like to briefly talk about the Center. For those of you who don't know us, we are a 20-year-old nonprofit that brings together business, government, and community leaders to engage in fact-based strategic planning and collaboration on issues of great importance to the Houston region. Currently, our strategic planning work is focused on energy and climate, the importance of immigration, and healthcare and health equity. And through our business and civic leadership program, we train leaders to deepen their community involvement. We also seek to engage the community through webcasts like this one and hope to return to in-person events and conferences next year. As I mentioned, we are honored today to have Katharine Hayhoe, a globally renowned climate scientist and professor of political science at Texas Tech University, where she's the director of the Climate Science Center. She's also chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy, and her new book, Saving Us, A Climate Scientist's Case for Hope and Healing in a Divided World, is a great book. If you like a signed copy for $35, which we can mail to you, please see the link in the chat in order to order it. We're also pleased to have Lisa Gonzalez, who's been a longtime friend of the Center and is currently Vice President, Executive Director of the Audubon, Texas, and she'll be our moderator. In terms of how we're going to handle Q&A, Katharine will take questions later in the program via a digital tool called Poll Everywhere. She'll direct attendees on how to use it to answer questions towards the end of the, and how to join Poll Everywhere towards the end of the discussion. As a result, we've disabled the Q&A function here. But if you'd like to put your comments in the chat, feel free, but we'll be using Poll Everywhere for the discussion at the end of the webcast. So without ado, over to you, Lisa. I'm looking forward to a very interesting conversation.
Thank you, Brett, and welcome everyone to this event. Brett, thank you to you and the Center and your staff for organizing this conversation. It's always such a delight when we have Dr. Hayhoe joining us in Houston to talk about climate. And I can't think of a better organization to organize and host this event than the Center for Houston's Future, because as Brett said, the work that they do is about bringing together businesses, decision makers, and the community together on issues such as sustainability, healthcare, education, immigration, and those topics alongside of climate change require us to be innovative problem solvers that talk to one another, that communicate with one another. And that's what Dr. Hayhoe is talking about a lot these days with her new book that she'll be speaking to us about tonight. And I thought that I would start the conversation just kind of with the basics, because I think if we're going to discuss how we speak with one another about climate, how we think about the future, we've got to know where we are and where we're going. So Katharine, let's start off with discussing the nature of the problem. So we're really fortunate in that you and your team worked on the climate assessment for the city of Houston, I guess a year or two ago. And so I was wondering if you could start by telling us about the big picture look, about what's going on in Houston, what we're dealing with, what's already happening, and what might be in store for us in the greater Houston region in Southeast Texas.
Absolutely. I'm speaking to you from Lubbock, Texas, the other side of the state. But as you know, I work with Houston closely, visit often, and what happens in Houston affects all of us. So just a note, as Lisa and I go along, we're going to be discussing, but you can ask your questions at any time. And the way you do that is to go to pollev.com/myname. You have to make sure that you spell it right if you're typing it in. It's also in the link in the chat, so you could just click and just push skip. You don't have to enter your name. You can put in a question anytime, and here's the fun part. You can upvote other people's questions. So at the end, Lisa's going to be picking, and you're going to help her choose which questions by upvoting the ones that you most want us to answer. So you can go there anytime. You can go there on your phone. You can go there on your computer. When you go there on your phone, it will look like this. That looks normal. Enter your question anytime and check out the other questions people have asked and upvote those as well. The link will always be in the chat if you're looking for it. So I'm a climate scientist, and I look at what's happening in the places where we live. And I know that here in Texas, we have crazy weather. So wherever you live, you have hot and cold and wet and dry. And then if you live in Texas, you have hot and cold and wet and dry. But as climate changes, it is taking that crazy weather pattern and stretching it even further. So our extremes are getting even more extreme than they've been before. We know that our summer heat is getting more intense and more frequent, more days over 100 degrees. We know that our heavy rainfall is getting more frequent, to the point where some places in Houston have seen 3 500-year flood events in 3 years. It's not a 500-year flood event anymore when you're getting it every single year. That's how extreme our rainfall has gotten. Then we've got hurricanes. We know that Houston has always been hit by hurricanes. The Galveston hurricane of 1900 is still the most deadly hurricane on record because people didn't get an accurate weather forecast back then. They didn't know it was coming. They didn't get out of the way. Although the number of hurricanes is not changing, the hurricanes themselves are. They're powered by much warmer ocean water, so they are intensifying faster, much faster, from a category 1 or 2 to 3, 4, or 5. They also have a lot more rain associated with them. Some places in Harris County got more than 50 inches of rain. A few places, I think even 60 when all the total was said and done. And we are able to put a number on that today. We are able to determine that if the same Hurricane Harvey had happened without climate change, we would have had 40% less rain, and we would only have had a quarter of the economic damages. That's how climate change is making these events worse. We've always had hurricanes, but they're getting stronger, more intense, more rainfall. What about our droughts? Well, I've studied that, and our droughts are also getting longer and more intense. We know we have droughts anyways whenever it's a La Nina event. That happens naturally. But once the drought is here, when it's hotter and drier, that drought stays for longer, and it's more damaging than it would have been otherwise. So here in Texas, we are on the front lines of climate impacts. In fact, if I had to pick a single state in the whole country that was most vulnerable to climate impacts, it would be Texas. But that means just because we have the most to lose means we also have the most to gain from climate action. And that's what's so exciting about Texas too.
That's such important information. And, especially for those of us that seem to be living on the forefront of climate change in the United States. And so when we hear or think about climate change, we often, I guess, think of it as maybe an environmental issue, because so many of the impacts that we feel, like you said, they come through as drought, as flood, as hurricanes, but climate change is also something that impacts our economic and societal systems. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about the concept. I've heard you talk about this before, Katharine, the concept of a threat multiplier. What exactly is that, and how does climate change exacerbate things that we might be dealing with?
So the phrase threat multiplier comes from the military. They're the ones who came up with this because they look at threats, which exist all the time, and then they look at what makes those threats worse. So in our case, droughts, floods, heat waves, hurricanes, wildfires, winter storms, we've had them all. But today we know that climate change is multiplying them, making them worse. Even our winter storm was made worse by warming in the Arctic. So what is that affecting? Well, often you're right. We think of climate change as an environmental issue that environmentalists care about and environmentalists work on, and the rest of us wish them well. We might make a donation to them. But when we look at what climate change is affecting, it turns out it affects not only the environment, it affects everything. It affects the safety of our home, the quality of the air that we breathe and the water we drink and even the food we eat, whether we can grow our crops or not, the local economy, national security, our health. To care about climate change, you only have to be one thing, and that's not an environmentalist. It's a human being living on this planet. And if we live in Texas, we have even more reason to care because we are on the front lines of sea level rise, of crazy weather, of all of this impacting us economically. But we also have the most to gain from climate solutions. So climate change, again, is an everything issue. Don't let anybody pigeonhole it, and don't do it yourself either. If you are at the Audubon Society, you care about it because it affects birds. If you're at the Nature Conservancy, as I am, you care about it because obviously it affects nature. But if you're a human being living in Houston, you care about it because it affects your home, your insurance rates, the local economy, the neighborhoods that flood the most. It affects every aspect of your life. And that's why climate change is literally, in my opinion, a human issue.
And so if, we're looking, if we look at climate change, like you said, like is an everything issue, it literally affects every aspect of our life. That means it's a very complicated issue with people on all sides. And so how do we, and this is where we kind of, I think, start to get into what you've been discussing in your book, your most recent book, how do we find common ground around an issue such as climate change? You've got folks like you and me that are working for conservation organizations. We've got folks and partners on this call who come from the energy industry, who may come from higher education, who may come from low and moderate income communities. What's the common ground? Kind of where do we start?
Mm-hmm. Well, that is exactly where we need to start, because all too often conversations begin with something that we disagree on rather than something we agree on. And those conversations are usually not going to go in a positive direction. But if we can begin over a shared concern or a shared interest or a shared value, then we can walk together along that path because we both care about this and we both want the best for this. What can we do to ensure that we get that? So those types of conversations, as I talk about in my book, Saving Us, they can begin over things as simple as we're both parents. Lisa and I, we first met in person when she was bringing her daughter to study at my university. We can begin conversations very powerfully over the place where we live, right? Because we all see things happening here. And in my book, I tell one story about how I was standing in line at church to pick up my son from Sunday school a couple of years ago. And the man behind me in line said, "Can I ask you a question?" I said, "Sure." And he said, "Is the weather getting weirder?" And I said, "Yes, it is. I have looked at it and it is definitely getting weirder." And he said, "I knew it. I've lived here for 30 years and I can see it's getting weirder." And so that started off a really productive conversation on what we'd seen, what we'd experienced, and what we were doing about it and how we could make a difference. So whoever we are, we can begin with these areas that we share. And I've even started, as I tell in the book, I've started conversations over the fact that, I knit or I enjoy cooking, or I garden, or I enjoy winter sports. But our sense of place is so powerful that that's always a great place to begin. So I want to ask you, Lisa, what's an example of common ground in Houston that people can come together on if they live in Houston, no matter where they fall in terms of where they work, where they fall on the political spectrum, where they fall socioeconomically? What can they come together on in Houston?
That is a very good question. And I think I would look back, and I'm going to actually go back to the organization that I worked at prior to Audubon, and that's the Houston Advanced Research Center. And I think a great example of that is maybe the Houston Climate Action Plan. I think that started with, like you said, it's a sense of place. It's a sense of pride in our community. We all see what's happening around us with, like you said, the 3 500-year floods, drought that we experienced a decade ago, and now even more recently the winter storm. But back in 2019, 2020, the city of Houston brought together a number of people to create a climate action plan for the city of Houston. And that was a diverse group of people that came from all walks of life, all backgrounds, with the idea that we could come together to create the first plan. We knew it wasn't going to be, I think everybody who participated in that process knew that it wasn't going to be the be all end all to every, climate issue that Houston's going to face, but we have to start somewhere. And it is an amazing starting point for the city of Houston. to look at its four major sources of greenhouse gases, to come up with a set of goals and strategies, actions, targets for both residents and businesses and the city to follow. To me, that's a really great example of where we've come together. And just being somebody who was kind of watching all of this happen, I remember at the very beginning wondering if we were going to be able to pull it off as a city, because you've done this work in other cities around the country and it's not easy. But they did it and released that climate action plan in spring of 2020. So it's really exciting. And I think that's a great example.
It is. Mayors and cities can often do so much more than at the state or the federal level. And they often realize how essential this issue is to people there. I remember a couple of years ago, the US Congress of Mayors met in Dallas, and I was asked to talk to them about climate change. So I talked to a room full of mayors about cities and climate change. And this was before the Houston Action Plan. And afterwards, a mayor came marching up to me and he said, "I'm a Republican." Like, that was the first thing he said to me. And normally if somebody comes marching up to a climate scientist and says, "I'm a Republican," well, a thermometer doesn't give you a different answer depending on how you vote. It matters to all of us. But because it's so polarized, typically that is usually then, afterwards people say, well, everything you said is garbage or something like that. No. He was a mayor. And so he came up and said, "I'm a Republican and climate change matters to everybody. It does not matter who you vote because it is affecting you where you live. And here's what I see where I live in Illinois, and we all need to fix it." And I was like, "Will you please run for president?" And I think he was too smart to say yes to that one. But cities are so powerful, and often we can come together in cities in a way that we find very difficult to come together at the federal or even the state level. But in cities we can, because we live in the same neighborhoods, we know the same people, we know the same place. And that gives us a very strong aspect of our identity that can overcome some of our political polarization.
That's an excellent point. Mm-hmm. And I think the other thing that I'm thinking about a lot these days, I think because especially, for those of us that watch the news, that watch our social media feeds, it's becoming pretty clear that we run the risk of being so overwhelmed by the sheer scope of climate change. And like you said, it affects everything and it touches everyone, that we run the risk of being so overwhelmed that inaction can become the path forward, which is something that none of us can afford. And so how do we, in your conversations and what you've learned in talking to people around the United States and around the world, how do we tackle the sheer scale about what we need to do around climate? And we've talked a little bit about conversations and engaging, but who needs to be engaged in this collective conversation?
That, Lisa, is exactly the right question to be asking right now, because for so long, we feel like people need to wake up. People need to understand this is bad. And so our headlines are filled with doom-filled stories about polar bears and Arctic sea ice and Antarctic glaciers. But we've reached the point now where 70% of people in the United States are very worried about climate change already, 70%.
Wow.
But you know what? 50% of us feel hopeless and helpless. 50% hopeless and helpless. The biggest problem we have is not that we don't think this thing is real. Nowadays, you have to be living under a rock. And even people who wouldn't admit it, they know it. They know it. Trust me. I live in Lubbock. I know. But the biggest problem we have is that we don't know what to do about it. We are just overwhelmed by this. And so earlier today, I was giving a talk at a science writers conference. So people who write about the science all the time, they write about all the latest scientific studies. That's what they write about. And so I asked them, because you can use Poll Everywhere for asking people questions too, not just getting them. I see there's some nice questions coming up here on Poll Everywhere. Keep up the good work. We're going to get to those soon. So I asked the science writers who are immersed in climate change writing, I said, how do you feel about climate change in one word? And they gave me one word. And then I talked about exactly this, about how the biggest thing that we're missing is a sense of efficacy. If we do something, can we make a difference? And you know what? The answer to that is yes. And how do we build efficacy? By looking around and recognizing that climate action is not a giant boulder sitting at the bottom of a steep hill with only a few hands on it. yours and mine and Al Gore's and maybe Jane Goodall, no, that boulder is already at the top of the hill and it is rolling down the hill in the right direction. And there are millions of hands on that boulder. And when we start to realize whose hands are on it and what they're doing, the city of Houston's, the mayor, all kinds of people in the city itself, faith groups, business leaders, all the people that the Center for Houston's Future is working with, all of those people's hands are on that boulder, pushing it down the hill. And when we realize it, we realize that if we added ours too, it might make a difference. And so that's what gives us hope. And that's why I wrote my book, Saving Us, to show how many different hands there are on the boulder and how we can add our hand too by adding our voice to this. And I want to share something really cool with you, if you don't mind. This was so encouraging. So at the beginning, I said, give me one word for how you feel about climate change. And the words I got were, and I'll show you this picture in a minute, overwhelmed, frustrated, stressed, hopeless, depressed, anxious, and intimidated. And I feel that. I mean, I'm a scientist. I see this all the time. But when I talked about how what we really are missing is that sense that we can make a difference, and when I talked about all the people who are making a difference and about how we can help people by using our voice to talk about what we can do in our business, in our neighborhood, in our city, in our place of work, in our church, whatever organization we're part of, then I asked at the very end, I asked them the same question. And this is the answer I got at the end. Here we go. The top is before and the bottom is after.
I love that. As you were listing off those initial words that came up, I was like, oh my gosh, that's just, all of those words are negative. There's nothing positive there. But look at the second group. I know that's how I feel after I talk to you every time, so that doesn't surprise me. And hopefully that's what our participants tonight walk away with. That's amazing.
It is. And I love how it wasn't just hopeful, it was empowered, determined, activated, because hope doesn't come and find you. You have to go find it. And how you do that is by acting. So when we feel overwhelmed, we need to connect with others and do what we can in the sphere that we're in. You might not be a president or a prime minister or a CEO. I'm not. I don't know if anybody listening is, but each of us can make a difference where we are. And I just heard a really awesome story just yesterday that illustrates this. I just heard yesterday that the Presbyterian Church of Ireland just voted in their General Assembly to divest from fossil fuel investments.
Wow.
And the woman who was reading out the call before the vote actually quoted from Saving Us, from my book, about how climate change affects the poorest and most vulnerable people. And as Christians, one of our key values is to love others and to care for others. And so they actually voted based on that to divest from fossil fuels. Now, I recognize that's not a step that everybody would necessarily take. And I really honor and respect the people who are working inside the fossil fuel industry, people who work for Exxon and Chevron and Shell and BP. There's amazing people who work inside the organization. There's people on their shareholder boards, like Engine Number One, who are working to influence them from that perspective. There are people who are working on new ways to get energy from algae and biofuels and efficiency and all kinds of things like that. There's people at every level that are working on this issue. And that is so important to do because we need everybody wherever we are, and we can all use our voices to help.
Wow. Well, and so as we have these conversations and folks begin to use their voice and to engage others, I've heard you say a number of times, and you say it again in Saving Us, that when we're talking to people, we shouldn't use a confrontational approach. And this is hard for me as a scientist, facts and figures don't always sway people in the conversation, and definitely fear isn't something that we should use to get people to engage and talk to others about climate action. So I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about the methods that you suggest for engaging others. I saw you, I think it was on CBS Saturday Morning last week, where you were talking to people, I think up in Dallas, and just, having a conversation with folks. That was really neat to watch how you did that. you know, I think also one of the other things that you introduced me to was the 6 Americas of global warming, which folks who are attending tonight may not be aware of. So I'm wondering if you can maybe talk about what are some of these approaches? How do, you know, people think in general about climate change and climate action with the 6 Americas, and what can we take from that here in Houston and in Texas as we seek to have these conversations with friends, family, our decision makers?
Absolutely. So I'm going to share my screen with you again. And if anybody's having problems with Poll EV, you can just put your questions in the chat and they'll be moved over there, but it is working. And we actually have a lot of great questions already there that people have been voting for, which is fantastic. So thank you very much. I think we have about 10 questions so far. So we often think of people as falling into 2 groups, us and them. That is how we often think about it. But on climate change, we really fall along a spectrum. And you know what? The majority of us are alarmed, concerned, or cautious. The majority of us. So we often think when I say, well, we should be talking about climate change, people are like, oh, I want to run to the nearest dismissive person, the one who is always going on about how it's a hoax. Whenever I see them on Facebook, whenever I talk to them in person, whenever we have dinner together, they always bring something up about how it's a hoax. I want to go talk to them. Well, they are very loud, and we all know one or more, but they're only 8% of the population, 8%. And you know what? My personal definition of a dismissive is someone who, if an angel from God with tablets of stone saying global warming is real and foot-high letters of flame appear to them, they would not change their minds. So why would I think that I could? I don't think I can. The good news, though, is that 92% of us are not. We're not. And the majority of us are alarmed, concerned, or cautious, but we're paralyzed, we're frozen, we don't know what to do. So often people say, well, everybody thinks like me. I just live in a bubble. Why should I talk about this? I would bet you anything that everybody around you, even if you think they all agree, they don't know what to do. They are probably concerned, worried, might be depressed. They sure as heck are not activated or hopeful. So that's what we can do by having these conversations, is connect the dots, why it matters to us, begin with something that we share, and then talk about positive, constructive solutions that we can engage in. Because there's some really good news. And I'm going to share this link in the chat as well, or Laura will put it in the chat. This is a really interesting series of maps that shows people's opinions about things. And what I love about this is they have about 30 different questions, and you can dig in by congressional district or by county. So we're going to look at this by county. Here's the whole United States, and I'm going to zoom in on Texas. Ready? Here we go. You can play with this yourself afterwards. So just follow me here, and then, you know, you can do as much as you want later. So here we have the percentage of people who think that global warming is happening. And in Harris County, we're at 72%, which is exactly the national average. Exactly. I live over here in Lubbock, which is 67, a little bit below. Over here in Austin, it's higher. Travis County, 62 or 82. Okay. It's real. That's fine. But do I think global warming will affect me personally? This is the bigger problem we have. Look at that. Wow. In Houston and Harris County, the number drops to 50%, and all around Harris County, it's below 50%. We don't think it matters to us. So what can we use our voice to talk about? Hey, did you know that hurricanes are getting stronger, and 3/4 of the damage due to Hurricane Harvey was because it was supersized by a warmer ocean? Did you know that we had 3 500-year flood events in Houston alone? And in fact, Lisa and my colleague Gavin had to call into one of our meetings once because he was stuck in a parking lot in his car and it was flooded and he couldn't leave all day. So these are the types of things that we can say. And then it's going to get worse before it gets better, okay? Do you ever talk about it? No. Look at that.
Wow.
Harris County, 34% of people discuss it occasionally, not regularly, occasionally. And if you don't talk about it, why would you care? And if you don't care, why would you ever want to do anything to fix it? And you might say, well, I don't talk about it because everybody disagrees over the solutions. We think they do because that's what we see in the media. The media feeds off people disagreeing with each other. I was talking to a colleague recently who has a show where he disagrees with somebody. That's what the whole show is about. But he and that guy actually agree on a lot of things. And so they said to their producer, can we have 5 minutes at the end where we agree? And the producer said, okay, fine, try it out. So they did it for 2 weeks. Then they got called into the office and the producer's like, I'm sorry, your ratings drop when you agree. Nobody wants to listen to you agree. So in the media, all we hear is people arguing. But when we ask people, let's just pick a solution here. There's great solutions here. Do you think we should be funding research into renewable energy sources like wind and solar, where Texas is already number 1 and number 2, respectively, in the country? This is a heck yes. Look at these colors. 83% in Harris County. Do you think we should be putting a price on carbon as is currently being proposed in the budget bill? It turns out 66% of people say yes in Harris County, a price on carbon, which is incidentally a free market bipartisan approach that is endorsed by every major oil and gas company. So call your elected representative today, because they're voting on the budget in a couple of weeks, and tell them, hey, we support a price on carbon. What about tax rebates for energy efficient vehicles or solar panels? Yes, that's a big yes, right? And look at all the areas around Houston. They're pretty dark too. So there are all kinds of solutions that we talk about, like should corporations do more to address global warming? That's a yes. Should Congress do more to address global warming? Blue some places, but yes in Harris County. Should the president do more to address global warming? That's still a yes. So there's all kinds of interesting solutions. Should citizens do more to address global warming? That's orange almost all through all of Texas. There's only one little county up here, Jack County, where it's 50%. Over here, Sabine County, 50%. Everybody else is orange. So we don't really know what people think. And if you look at this, you'll get a few surprises. And it'll give us some interesting things to talk about. Like, did you know that 2/3 of us think we should put a price on carbon? Isn't that interesting? Let's look at some Republican politicians. Let's look at some oil and gas companies. They support it too. Let's look at what that looks like. Let's call our elected representative and say, I support this. It seems to make sense. There's all kinds of amazing information that we can get from these maps.
That is an amazing tool. And it takes me back to the word cloud that you showed earlier, where everybody started off just feeling so overwhelmed and, unable to affect change. And when you look at that kind of data, it also goes back to common ground. There's a lot more common ground on these solutions and around these issues than we think. And then that maybe more than what we're getting from the media. And maybe some of the social media feeds that we're following. Wow. So here in Houston, so now I want to kind of transition a little bit, I think, to an issue and a part of our economy that's just central to our region, and that's energy and the energy transition. And, Houston has some unique circumstances that, you've talked about earlier. At the same time that we're dealing with things such as hurricanes, flood, drought, freeze, we're also known as the energy capital of the world. We call ourselves that, and we like to think others call us that too. We certainly call ourselves that. And much of our history has been tied to the oil and gas industry, and we still have a large portion of our economy and jobs that are tied to the oil and gas industry. But we also know that we've got, as the energy capital of the world, we've got the potential to be a leading clean energy hub. And organizations like Center for Houston's Future, they're leading the way in, having these conversations and engaging in research and market assessment and commercialization and getting others involved in that as well. But there's this corner, I think, of maybe people, and I don't know, maybe your data will say something different, but it seems like there's there are folks in a corner that say, well, if we engage in this energy transition, it could actually add to the volatility of our energy-based economy. So we've got to be really careful. But then, you've got Center for Houston's Future, you've got HARC, where I came from, and others that are really talking about this as a positive way, that it can be a boon for our economy. We don't have to focus on the negative. We should seize this as a moment of opportunity. And so when it comes to clean energy, what should we be considering in terms of leadership opportunities for our region? What should we be doing as a region, perhaps that we're not doing now, so that we can position ourselves to be this clean energy hub and clean energy leader of the future?
Well, the world is changing faster now than it has since our great-grandparents' time. I have a picture of my great-grandmother when she got married. She was sitting in a horse and a buggy with a hat and a full Victorian-style dress. And then I have a picture of her 4 years later with two little boys sitting in a giant automobile with bobbed hair and a short skirt. The world is changing just as quickly now as it was back then, but it has not changed that fast for over a century, technologically and socially speaking. So of course, when we see things changing, it's scary. It makes us nervous. We feel like, well, we've been using fossil fuels since the 1800s. They've been good enough for us for 200 years. Why should we be changing now? The reason is because we have something new and we have something better. And somebody might say, better? Don't you know that the wind doesn't blow all the time and the sun doesn't shine at night? Yes, I do know that. Scientists figured that one out a while ago. But what do I mean by better is, first of all, it's renewable. It doesn't run out on us. Second of all, it doesn't produce the air pollution that's responsible for nearly 9 million premature deaths around the world every year. Air pollution just from fossil fuels. That's a pretty heavy toll to be paying for our energy. Second of all, we have sources of energy that don't produce heat trapping gases that are building up in the atmosphere, wrapping an extra blanket around our planet, causing us to warm. We have sources of energy that don't spill and pollute, like the oil spill on the California coast right now as we speak. So what I say, and I actually have a global weirding episode on this. I put the link to global weirding in the chat. Yvette had some kind comments on those little videos that I have on YouTube. I have an episode on fossil fuels where I say, I am genuinely and profoundly grateful for the benefits that fossil fuels have brought us. If we lived 200 years ago, I mean, I'm convinced I probably would have died at an early age, thanks, without the medical advances that came with the Industrial Revolution. But even if we were living, our lives would be an endless litany of chores. We would have no electricity, no appliances, no light other than maybe kerosene or whale oil. We would likely have no opportunity to be educated because our lives would just be a constant drudgery of washing clothes, getting food, doing more. And our lives would be much shorter. Lifespan before the Industrial Revolution was half what it is today, half. So most of us here wouldn't even be here. So I am very profoundly grateful for the Industrial Revolution and everything that it brought us. I'm grateful for my fridge. I'm grateful for my car. I'm grateful that I can fly home to see my parents when I need to. But just as we no longer use horses and buggies and party line telephones, in the same way, it's time to transition to new clean sources of energy that do not pollute our air and our water, that do not run out on us, that do not produce heat trapping gases, but that can be produced right here in Texas. Because of course, we lead the whole US in wind energy. And battery technology is a huge area of development. And it's so big now that I think one Hawaiian island is already entirely powered by solar and batteries. Puerto Rico's grid is going 100% renewable because they have the battery backup to do it. It's no longer new technology today. Maybe 5 years or 10 years ago it was, but not anymore. We've got what we need for the storage to stabilize the grid. Here in Texas, when I moved here 15 years ago, we were not even on the top 10 list for solar producing states. Now we're number 2, and we are going to overtake California within a year, I think. They're building the biggest solar farm in the whole US just outside of Dallas. So Texas knows energy. Texas can continue to provide energy. Texas even has some of the technology you need, like to produce hydrogen, which is a huge source of clean energy. It's some of the same technology that they use in the oil and gas industry. We know energy and we cannot afford to be left behind because believe me, people often say, well, what about China and India? Well, China has more wind and solar energy installed than the United States by a magnitude. India is aiming to be the first country to become fully developed without relying entirely on coal to do so. We stand at a time when the world is changing faster than any time in our personal histories. And the question is, will we get ahead of that? Or will we lag behind? That is the choice that Texas faces today. So give me an example, Lisa, of what's happening in Texas. Give me an example of how is Houston getting ahead of that wave, ahead of that curve?
I think I'd look to the commitment that our city is making around climate and climate action. And perhaps a good example of that is, we've got the coalition of climate mayors around the United States, mayors that have made the commitment to the Paris Climate Agreement and have committed to being leaders in their communities. And that coalition right now is led by our own mayor, Mayor Turner. And so that's a commitment that he made on behalf of the city of Houston a year ago. And so I think when the leader of our city steps out and says, this is important and we want to be a leader in this conversation on the national stage, I think that's a huge signal to the rest of us. That, there is a role for Houston to play, and he's positioning us. He's basically opening the door and saying, okay, we want to engage here. And so, let's walk through the store together. So to me, that's one that comes to mind just from the last year.
I love that.
So as we look at the energy transition, and this is an issue that's really come to the forefront since Hurricane Harvey. It's the issue of equity. We have leaders in our community, such as Dr. Bob Bullard at Texas Southern University, who of course have been working on issues around equity for decades. But in the energy and climate conversation, it's also rising to the forefront that as we move forward with this energy transition, there's a possibility that a number of people are going to be left behind because they either don't have access to wealth, they don't have access to resources or education, so they may not be able to access the new technologies that may be coming, or they may not be able to engage in the new clean energy economy. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on that, and how do we ensure that the transition is equitable and inclusive, so that people from all walks of life, all backgrounds, all levels of economic status can participate?
That's so important because the impacts of climate change are already completely inequitable. Even right here in Texas, people who live in lower income neighborhoods are much more likely to be exposed to air pollution from burning fossil fuels. They're much likely to live in a flood zone because it was more affordable to live in that neighborhood. And during the crazy winter storm that we had this past February, we all lost power pretty much across the state. But the homes and the people who had the most difficulty were the people who could not afford to insulate their home. They lived in a rental home or a mobile home. They couldn't afford to purchase a generator. They might have broken windows. And often those neighborhoods, the power was out for longer because, companies prioritize where they put the power back on.
Right.
And so we already see that the impacts are inequitable. And so even more importantly, we have to make sure that the solutions are equitable, that the solutions clean up the air that people breathe, that they make our neighborhoods more resilient and more prepared for flooding, that they enable people to live in a home that's safe, to not be exposed to dangerous risks from climate change, and to continue to have a job, to support their family, to have access to education, to the basic health care that so many of us take for granted. It's so important to look at those issues together. And the good news is a lot of climate solutions are good for all of us, but they are disproportionately good for the people who need them the most. Let me give you a tangible example from my half of the state, and then I want to hear some from you. So here in West Texas, there are a lot of rural communities. Midland, Amarillo, and Lubbock are not giant cities. They're, less than 300,000 people. And in between, there's so many small towns that have just been absolutely hemorrhaging young people because there's no tax base to go into schools, medical facilities, anything that you'd want to raise a young family there. Well, along comes the wind energy industry. And for every megawatt of new wind or solar in Texas, it supplies 8 times more local jobs than the same amount of electricity generated from natural gas would. Where do wind turbines go up? They go up in rural areas. And so some rural counties have seen their tax base increase by a factor of 10, thanks to new wind farm production going in around the area. It brings in lots of young workers. Wind energy technician has been right at the top of the fastest growing jobs in the country since 2015, according to the Bureau of Labor. It revitalizes that rural area. It brings in the services that people need to be able to live there and raise their families there. And it's completely transforming our rural economies in much of West Texas, which up until now have either been farming with migrant workers or down more in the Permian Basin, oil and gas extraction, which has a huge bust cycle. And it's not something that you want to raise a family on if it's just this, job, no job, job, no job. So we are seeing the benefits of clean energy here in West Texas. But what are you seeing in Houston?
So in Houston, and just, to add, I totally agree with what you're saying about the role that clean energy can play in rural economies. Some of our programs are around grasslands conservation at Audubon. And I think we're having conversations now that there's a real partnership between what conservation organizations can do in rural communities in concert with, groups that are bringing clean energy solutions to that part of the state. And, as far as Houston is concerned, I think there's some really exciting things happening, kind of looking at what I think of as both sides of the coin, two sides of the coin for this question. First is, how can people access technology, new clean energy technology? And I think there's some great things being done by organizations that are looking at opportunity zones and working to develop retail electricity products, for example, that can be deployed in low and moderate income communities so that households can both have access to renewable energy such as solar and battery storage to provide resilience for themselves when there's an extreme weather event. That partnership is being led by HARC, by the Texas Energy Poverty Research Institute. There's Energy Well Texas. All of these organizations are engaging in this space. On the job side, I think there's some really exciting things happening with regards to what Greater Houston Partnership is doing with their upskill program, working with employers to develop the career pipeline, making sure that folks can access these clean energy and industry jobs with more than high school, beyond high school, but less than a 4-year degree. And Greentown Labs, that's another organization that's come to Houston in the last year that's working with entrepreneurs to, create the market for clean energy projects and products in Houston. So I think there's a lot of great things going on. All right, I want to be sure that we've got time for poll everywhere, but I do want to ask, since you and I are both with conservation organizations, you at the Nature Conservancy, me at Audubon, I want to ask, how do you think nature can play a role in addressing the impacts of climate change? And what are your thoughts on nature-based solutions and those kinds of projects?
Well, I was a huge fan before joining the Nature Conservancy. I just want to be very clear on that. And here's why. It's because I'm a scientist. So this is what the problem we have. Picture the atmosphere as a bathtub. And we already had the perfect natural level of carbon dioxide in our bathtub. What we humans have done is we have gone and stuck a giant faucet on the bathtub, and we have turned it up every single year. So there is more and more and more CO2 coming out of that faucet every year. So what happened to the level of CO2 in the bathtub? It went up faster and faster. Wow. It's getting up so high, we're afraid it might drown us. Not literally, I'm just saying in terms of climate change. Okay, so what can we do to fix this? Well, first, stop turning the faucet up. Then second, start turning the faucet down. But what else does a bathtub have? It's got a drain.
Drain, yes.
It's got a drain. And the drain is something that takes carbon out of the atmosphere, because carbon itself is a good thing. Carbon is the building blocks of life. Carbon in the soil is healthy. It's a fertilizer. Carbon in ecosystems is healthy. That's what they're made of. So if we can also make the drain bigger, it will take more carbon out of the bathtub and it will help us out. It's not a replacement for turning down the faucet. We have to turn down the faucet. There's no ifs, ands, buts about that. But we can also make the drain bigger. It will take out some more of the carbon and help us even more. How do we make the drain bigger? By investing in nature, by investing in blue and green nature. That means the ocean and the biosphere. Together, the ocean and the biosphere, they each have 100 times more carbon in them naturally than we humans have produced since the dawn of the industrial era. So there's a lot of carbon that can go in there. How do we put the carbon in there? Obviously, tree planting, that's the first thing people often think of, but that isn't even the most useful aspect. What about restoring degraded ecosystems? What about conserving ecosystems that already exist? What about protecting our coastlines with coastal wetlands that also protect us from storm surge and filter water and also help take up carbon? What about mangrove forests? 100 feet of mangroves on the coast reduce wave height by 66%. So along comes the hurricane, massive wave, 100 feet of mangroves, the wave is reduced by 2/3 by the time it actually hits the neighborhood that lies behind. Oh, and it takes up carbon too. What about cover crops out here in West Texas? Where you grow cover crops, it prevents erosion, all those terrible dust storms that we get. You plow the cover crops back into the soil. All of that carbon they took out of the atmosphere goes back into the soil. It is like Miracle Grow on steroids. That's a technical term from an ag professor. And it takes up carbon, but it also enriches the soil. I was talking to a local farmer, Jack Scott, and he practices cover crops and conservation agriculture. And he says his neighbors come over and they say, so what are you doing? What's your secret? And he's like, well, I do this and I do this. I do these nature-based solutions. Like, no. We know you've got a secret fertilizer. What is it? And he's like, it's just carbon. I'm just using carbon as a fertilizer. And like, we don't believe you. You're doing something. And he says, no, I will tell you what I'm doing, and it's not a secret. So there are amazing nature-based solutions that help us grow more cotton, grow more food, healthier soils, protect our coastlines, restore ecosystems, protect habitat, prevent zoonosis, which of course is when when animals come in contact with humans and viruses jump from animal populations to humans, we know what happens. All of these are nature-based solutions. Oh, and they take up carbon too. They are win-win-wins. And the only question is, why are we not doing these win-win-wins? And Jeff says he'd like a list of those. I will put some more information in the chat on that. That is great.
That would be great. And if I can just add one more to the list,
Please.
Birds. It helps birds. I mean, as Audubon, I've got to say that.
Yes, please do. Yes, it does help birds. And I would just touch on something that somebody raised, which is one concern people often have with wind turbines is birds. And wind turbines should not be sited in migratory flyways. They should not.
Right.
There's also concern with bats. And so there's a lot of very smart people, including people at my university, who are looking at things that you can do, including they actually found that painting the turbines purple helped with bats. I just can't picture a whole field of purple turbines. But there's also things you can do, like siting them higher up, so they're out of the flyways, turning them off at dusk and dawn, which is when the bats go around. There are specific things that we can do to help protect our birds and help protect our bats. Because you know what the bottom line is? Fossil fuels kill an order of magnitude more birds than wind turbines do. And fossil fuels produce heat trapping gases that, if left unchecked, could lead to the extinction of 30% of the entire species on the whole planet. There is no free lunch for energy yet, unfortunately. I wish there was. But there is a very, very, very expensive lunch. And then there is the lunch that is quite affordable and could be made better. And that's part of what Audubon does, don't they?
Right. Exactly. And those are issues that we're working on more and more. People think of us as a conservation organization that focuses on birds, rightly so. That's what we do. But we as an organization, we identify climate change as being the #1 threat to birds and their habitats in this country. And so a lot of what we do these days is around clean energy and climate, for sure. Well, let's switch to Poll Everywhere, because we do have some great questions. We've got a little bit of time left. I want to be sure that we get to a couple of these questions. And for those of you that are on the website, you can use the thumbs up to kind of upvote questions if you think they're really good ones. And I'm going to go the easy route and start from the top. So we have a question, and the question is, how would you frame the dilemma of climate change to those who believe they must choose between a low carbon future versus an impacted bottom line?
I would say simply this: the economy cannot float around in outer space without the resources this planet provides. The whole false debate of environment versus economy completely neglects the fact that what is our economy based on? Everything we get off this planet. What does climate change threaten? Our economy and the future of civilization as we know it. No civilization, no economy. our economy needs to function as a circular economy. I don't know if you've heard that phrase. I'm sure you have, Lisa.
Yes.
A circular economy is one that takes into account what goes into it and what comes out of it, because our economy was built on the theories of economists from back in the previous century who effectively operated. I know this is going to sound crazy, but stay with me. They did. They literally did. They effectively operated as if we lived on a flat, infinite planet. They assumed that there was infinite resources to go in and that there was infinite waste disposal to go out. But we know, and we knew back then, that we don't live on an infinite planet. We live on a round planet, literally a round planet, that whatever goes in also comes out. And we also know that our planet is finite. And so there's a really awesome book called Donut Economics by Kate Raworth. I personally found economics so boring that I dropped out of my first year class because I kept falling asleep. And then I read Donut Economics. I was like, this is fascinating. I loved that book. It was so good. Donut Economics basically explains how, look, we live on a round planet. We need our economic system to include what goes in and what goes out. And that's what carbon pricing is about. It's about putting a price on the waste that goes out. So that if you want to drive a huge gas guzzler, you can drive it, but you are going to pay for the damages that causes for that other person. So you are not infringing on their personal liberties, on their health, and on their pocketbook, which in today's economy, we are.
And so moving from the economy to something that I think is very important to you, and it's something that makes you such an engaging and interesting climate communicator, is your involvement in the faith community. And in so many communities like Houston, the faith community can be a big driver of change and a big driver of community conversations. So, you know, we've got, the question is that the faith community is now looking more closely at these issues, and what can people of faith who are engaged do to help mitigate climate impacts, especially those, as we spoke earlier, about vulnerable communities?
Well, we, each of us, the most important thing that any of us can do, no matter who we are, no matter where we live, no matter how old we are, doesn't matter, is to use our voice to talk about why it matters, how it connects to our values, our loves, our concerns, our priorities, and about what we could do about it. So here's what you can do in the faith community. Well, first of all, like I said, my little global weirding series, our second most popular episode is, what does the Bible say about climate change? Climate change directly relates to what we believe. As Christians, we believe that God gave us responsibility over every living thing on this planet. That's Genesis chapter 1, which includes our sisters and our brothers. It includes humans too. We also believe that we are to be recognized by our love for others. Wouldn't the world look a little different if everybody who claimed to be a Christian was recognized not by their judgmentalism, not by their, adamant politicization, but by their love for other people? Which today definitely includes caring about climate change. Because what is climate change other than a failure to love our direct neighbor in Houston, as well as our global neighbor on the other side of the world, whose crops are being harmed by climate change, or who's losing their place where they live due to sea level rise? Mm-hmm. So as Christians, we have every reason to care. In fact, if we take the Bible seriously, we'd be out at the front of the line demanding climate action. What can we do? I actually have a little thing on my website. I get lots of frequently asked questions. So on my website, I have frequently asked questions. And one of them is, what should my church do? Well, you can talk about it. You can find out about organizations like the Catholic Climate Covenant if you're Catholic, or the Evangelical Environmental Network if you're Protestant, or Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, or Christian organizations that work in some of the poorest countries in the world, like World Vision or Plant with Purpose or Rasha. I have a whole list of them on my website, and I'll put the link here. You can find out about their information. You can share it with people in your church. You can make a green team. You can reduce your carbon footprint. You can do an energy audit. And actually, one of our graduates, Colby May from Texas Tech, he went and he did an MDiv degree in seminary. And now he runs a company that does energy audits for churches and schools and seminaries to help them reduce their energy use, transition to clean energy, save money, and use that to help people. So there's so many things we can do within any type of group. It doesn't have to be a church. It could be a community group, the Rotary Club, the Lions, your kid's school, your own school, your place of work. You get the picture. But all of us can use our voice to make a difference, because all of us were affected by climate change because we're humans living on this planet. We have every reason we already need to care. There's the link to my frequently asked questions if anybody's interested.
Awesome. Well, Katharine, our hour is up. it always goes so fast. I always feel like we need more time to cover all of these issues. And, you know, like you said, earlier and what you alluded to, I'm leaving this conversation feeling hopeful, feeling energized, feeling positive that, you know, Houston's moving in a great direction with leadership like Center for Houston's Future and others that are on this call. And just the fact that we've got all of these wonderful people, and thank you all for joining us. We've got people who care and who really want to get engaged and move climate action forward in Houston. So thank you so much for this evening. And Brett, I'm going to hand it back over to you.
Yes, and I just want to thank both of you, Katharine and Lisa, for really an amazing conversation. This is the kind of thing that we need to do to communicate about climate change. And Katharine, you are such a great communicator, and you make this so engaging and so simple that I think it's just such a great message. So thank you for being with us. And Lisa, thanks for doing an amazing job in facilitating the conversation. We have more information on our website about our work at futurehouston.org/energy if you want to read some about our work. And also, if you want Katharine's a book and get it a signed copy, please feel free to order it, and we'll send you one soon. So thank you all for tonight. Thank you, Katharine and Lisa, for a great conversation, and we look forward to seeing you all next time.